be worth the wait. I welcome you to our second series of 3 webinars. My name is Trish Mayer, and I'm the Partnerships Manager at SMAS WorkSafe. My role is mainly to work with current affiliate and member benefit partners, such as UKATA, and to support marketing opportunities, including webinar promotion. I also then go ahead and source new partners who would be able to enhance our membership base. SMAS WorkSafe is a member of the FSC, and we provide health and safety accreditation, which is of benefit to contractors. What we also offer is a preferred supplier compliance pack. And this is for contractors wanting to present a full set of documents when tendering. So the preferred supplier consists of your health and safety, which is your stage 1 health and safety, and then also environmental and quality policies, financial, anti-bribery and corruption, and modern slavery policies. In the first webinar hosted by SMAS WorkSafe, UKATA and Senior Operations gave an overview of UKATA and the various types of training requirements. Today we're going to be looking at duty to manage and where the responsibility lays when managing asbestos in buildings. It gives me great pleasure to introduce you to our presenter and our panel member today. Graham O'Mahony has been actively involved with UKATA Board of Directors for several years and is currently the chair of UKATA. Graham has over 20 years experience within the asbestos industry, and in addition to running his own successful business, he commits a significant amount of his time to the association. He's very passionate about raising the standards in asbestos training and offers his expertise and time freely to UKATA for the benefit of the industry. Once again, thank you to Marcus Rose, our Director of Technical Services at SMAS WorkSafe, for availing yourself as a panel member to answer any questions that may come up on the health and safety or environmental side. Marcus is responsible for our preferred supplier compliance in areas to include health and safety, quality and environmental. He also manages our in-house team of assessors, ensuring that we consistently meet our obligations under the SSIP. I will now hand you over to our presenter, Graham O'Mahony.
Thank you, Trish. Thank you very much for that very warm welcome. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to address to you all this afternoon. I'm here to give you a brief, and it will be very, very brief, understanding of asbestos management. Hopefully, by the end of the presentation, you'll be much clearer on what is required and, more importantly, who is responsible. You are hopefully all managing asbestos correctly. However, it has been recently highlighted by the Health and Safety Executive that greater clarity of duty holders' roles and responsibilities is required. And one of the biggest questions we face in industry is understanding the term management plan, sometimes seen as very corporate, very generic, very policy written. This gives the impression of compliance when in fact all we've done is tick a box. So I'll begin by sort of giving you a brief background of myself. As Trish has already explained, my name is Graham O'Mahony. I started my career in the construction sector as a plumbing and heating engineer. I then moved on to a building surveyor, as a building surveyor for a local authority. And whilst working as a building surveyor, I sidestepped the building surveying and moved into the asbestos surveying in the late 1990s, when it was very, very much in its infancy, and at the time we never had a duty to manage. I was then responsible for managing the asbestos throughout the authority, commercial buildings, schools, and various other public buildings. And I left local authority in the early 2000s and started in the private sector as a consultant and as a trainer. As Trish has already highlighted, I've been in the industry over 20 years, working mainly as a training provider, but quite recently setting up my own UCAS accredited laboratory for air monitoring and of course also asbestos surveying. And as already highlighted, I'm the current chair of UCATA, who this is being run in conjunction with. Now, content of what we're going to cover today, I'm sure you've all seen the agenda. So we're going to look at the managing asbestos in buildings, in particular the duty holder. We'll also consider the legislation relating to this, identify who the duty holder is, what they've got to do, how they can achieve this, and then also build in the role of the appointed person, which is not a new role, but it's becoming more and more prominent in industry with regards to duty holders passing on some of the work, not the responsibility, but some of the work to other parties within their organisation. So the history behind this started in 1995 when it was recognised by a couple of professors that identified the mortality rates for construction and maintenance personnel was on an increase. They originally thought that was due to the exposures back in the 1950s, 1960s, but they soon realised that they were continuing to be exposed to asbestos in their day-to-day work activities whilst undertaking refurbishment and maintenance works, and most of the time unknowingly disturbing asbestos. This was further looked at in 1998 when the HSE implemented new regulations, the Control of Asbestos at Work regulations, and brought the construction industry under that same regulation. And then further amendments to this were considered in the year 2000 when they consulted on the duty to manage. Now, this was written into the Control of Asbestos at Work regulations 2002 with an 18-month lead-in period before obviously being enforced from May 2004. So in theory, this is not new. This has been around for a long time. So we are talking November 2020 now. We are talking 16 and a half years old. I still find, though, there's a lot of confusion with people actually understanding what the management of asbestos is all about. So first thing we need to consider is who is the duty holder, and I'm sure we have many duty holders listening to this presentation today. The legislation requirement for this is under the Control of Asbestos Regulations 2012. The ACOP is L143, and Regulation 4, which is obviously specific to the duty to manage. And it states in Regulation 4, the duty holder is the person or organisation that has the main responsibility for maintenance or repair of non-domestic premises. So this would be schools, hospitals, some of your offices, commercial buildings. But just to note, it does say non-domestic, and there is no requirement under Regulation 4 to manage asbestos in domestic premises other than the common parts. But we will come back to that a little bit later. That says there is other legislation which is required to be complied with, which will obviously put an onus and responsibility onto landlords and people carrying out works within domestic premises. So to try to put that into some sort of visual for you and have a look at sort of various very simple scenarios of who the duty holder would be. The first one on the screen is the purple box there is, imagine that's being a building, and the building is owned and occupied by the same individual, say a director of a business or a chief exec, etc. But they own the building, they occupy the building. Now, this is where webinar training does have its limitations, and normally at this point I would ask the question. So based on that current scenario, based on the previous statement that we've just read out, who is the duty holder? I appreciate I can't hear any of you, but I would imagine most of you would probably get this one right, that the duty holder is going to be the owner. So it's very, very simple, because the owner would be responsible for the maintenance of their own building. This one's slightly different. So this is where we have a tenant who is responsible for the internal fabric of the building, and the landlord is responsible for the external and the structure outside of the building. So I'll ask the question again. I know you can't you can't shout out and tell me the answer, but some of you may have got the answer, some of you may not. But this is where we move on to what's called shared responsibility. So in theory, the tenant is responsible for the internal, they would be the duty holder for that demise, and the landlord would then be responsible for the external. Now, In cases like this, where we do have tenant and landlord responsibilities, one of the things we do need to be mindful of is we do need to maybe check the contracts and the lease agreements that these organisations have in place. And as such, with these lease agreements, it may put the onus of responsibility maybe all towards the landlord or maybe all towards the tenant. So tread carefully with this. It's not always as simple as it seems. And some of these lease agreements and tenancy agreements that I have been involved in the past, they don't actually specifically specify who is actually the responsible person or the duty holder with regards to the duty to manage. The last one, this would be where we've got 6 tenants. It could be 60 tenants, it could be 160 tenants. But of course, maybe something like a shopping centre or maybe a very large office block where rooms are let out to tenants. Let's assume that the tenants 1 to 6 there are responsible for their own internal demise, but the landlord or even the managing agent would then be responsible for the external and maybe the common parts. So again, this is another very simple case of shared responsibility. And again, I'll reiterate, what we need to consider here is the terms of the engagement, terms of the contract and the lease agreements do need to be considered. Now, obviously, when we talk about the duty holder, a lot of organisations will generally push this up to the top of the tree. So what I mean by that is it would be the chief executive or the managing director of the company who would generally take on that responsibility. So what we tend to find is that duty holders, if they are designated as duty holders, they don't necessarily have the time or the inclination or the competency and the knowledge to be able to manage asbestos effectively. So where it's a very complex buildings, what the duty holders will often do is they will nominate other people within their organisation who are considered competent to be able to take on that work that's required. What they can't do is they cannot pass on that legal responsibility. So if something does go wrong, then of course the duty holder will ultimately be liable for this. Now, this is where the appointed person was born many, many years ago. And UKATA identified this about 4 or 5 years ago and identified there was a gap in the training for appointed persons, but I will come on to that a little bit later. The appointed person might be an individual who's responsible for organising the surveys, organising the asbestos removal, maybe providing re-inspections within their own premises. What they must be is they must be competent, but they must also be adequately resourced from the duty holder. That doesn't necessarily mean by financial resources. It also means time. Asbestos management is or can be very time consuming, and it also can be very, very expensive. Now, for some of the larger organisations out there, it's very challenging to try to break down and to try to decipher who the actual duty holder is. And a number of years ago, I was asked this to define who the duty holder is with regards to a government facility and the contractor who was actually monitoring the maintenance. So what we decided to do was think about this from the bottom up as opposed to the top down. So what we need to look at here is this organogram that you'll see on the screen. First thing we need to think about is who is likely to become exposed to asbestos, who is potentially at risk. So, for example, we've got the internal contractors, the internal maintenance team, external contractors, we've got emergency services, or that could be utility services, we've got employees, and of course we've got visitors. So if we start from the bottom, they're the people we've got to think about protecting whilst obviously managing the asbestos. Now, what we're trying to achieve here is the top end, we're trying to find out who that duty holder is. So is it the chief exec, is it the chief operating officer, is it the MD, who will normally have overall responsibility and legal responsibility under the regulations. Now, there's no direct link there between the duty holder and all of these people. And in a lot of cases, what we tend to find is there's an intermediate. So example on the left there, the intermediate appointed person could well be the estates manager. So they would be responsible for looking after the internal contractors, the external contractors, maybe the utilities, emergency services. But again, there's no link there between the estates manager looking after the employees or visitors. They may have no control over what the employees do in their day-to-day business because the estates manager is responsible for the maintenance of the fabric of the building. Therefore, we might find we could have a secondary appointed person or an assistant maybe, who would assist the appointed person, the duty holder, and they would be maybe responsible for the day-to-day operations of the business, the staff, the visitors, direct managers, business managers, site managers, etc. But ultimately, they would then report back to the duty holder. So I appreciate this is not a one-size-fits-all, but it certainly can be used to try to decide who the duty holder is, and if we need any of those intermediates between, obviously, the duty holder and the people potentially at risk. Now, obviously, we've identified who the duty holder is. We now need to think about what the duty holders have actually got to do. So one of the things they are going to have to do is they're going to take reasonable steps to identify asbestos within their premises and, of course, check that condition. And that could be a way of doing a visual inspection, a walk through their building. It could be outsourced maybe to an asbestos surveying organisation. They may have to presume some materials contain asbestos. And again, that could be done internally or it could be outsourced. From that, what they would then need to do is put a written record together of the location and the condition of the asbestos, and then, of course, keep that record up to date. Now, again, this is where I'd normally ask my audience a question. How can we achieve the first three requirements of the duty holder, as you see on the screen? Well, the simple answer there is if we had an asbestos survey, the survey would identify, obviously, the asbestos. So I'm just going to try and bring up my little laser pointer. So the survey would pick up the materials, the locations. It may obviously make presumptions. And what the surveyor would do is actually provide a written record of where the asbestos contained materials are and, of course, their condition. So that can be very, very easily met. Now, once that's been provided, what will then be required by the duty holder is to risk assess anybody likely to become exposed to those asbestos containing materials. We would normally refer to this as the priority assessment that is undertaken by the duty holder. From that, they've now got their risk assessment, they've now got their locations, they've now got their understanding of the risks associated with the asbestos. What they can then do is put together their written plan, which obviously should detail any materials that are known are kept in a good state of repair. This would be done by maybe re-inspections and keep monitoring the asbestos. What they would then also consider is any materials which are vulnerable or likely to pose a risk to anybody, which can't necessarily be managed. They may have to be repaired, protected, or even removed. Then, of course, they have to consider that in their plan. And then the final one, which I think is the most important, is that the information on the location and condition of the material is provided to anyone. I've underlined the anyone because we do tend to find we concentrate quite a lot on the contractors, the maintenance contractors, but what about the employees, as we showed in our previous organogram? What about visitors to those premises? So it's not just the maintenance personnel, but there are employer-employee obligations that also need to be protected. So that's what the duty holder's got to do. Now, I said earlier in my first few slides that the domestic rented premises are not privy to the duty to manage under Regulation 4. So, of course, there's no legal requirement for landlords of domestic premises to comply with Regulation 4. However, it does apply to the common parts. So if we take the definition of a domestic premises as being a flat, and that flat, to get to that flat, we have to go through a corridor, we have to go up some stairs, and we have to go through another corridor. The flat is defined as a domestic premises in the sense that it's a premise where a person lives or resides. All the routes to get to that flat are defined as common, and as such, they would be required to be managed under Regulation 4. So you can see a list there, as I've mentioned, the staircases, the corridors, and it could involve lifts and lift shafts if they are also built within the actual building. So there is a requirement for landlords, but not on the domestic property, but on the common parts. Now, some organisations have many properties which we refer to as HMOs, or housing multiple occupation. So again, it's a domestic premises, but there are some non-domestic elements within those housing multiple occupations. So, for example, the bedrooms, the kitchen and the bathrooms, they would be defined as domestic, but there will be a corridor taking people along a thoroughfare to the bedroom, to the kitchen, to the bathroom. They would be classified as a non-domestic premises. Likewise, if anybody's involved in HMOs as opposed to a normal rented property, they have to have emergency lighting, fire escapes and fire extinguishers. So that's where we get the classification. It's a non-domestic premises. It doesn't mean that landlords don't have to do anything. Landlords will still have to do something under other legislation. So, for example, the Health and Safety at Work Act, you can see there, and Regulation 5, which I think is quite an important regulation, because Regulation 5 looks at the identification of asbestos prior to maintenance, refurbishment or any demolition. So if a landlord is carrying out works in a domestic property, under Regulation 5, the employer is required to identify asbestos within those premises. So again, a survey may be required within the domestic property to allow that maintenance work to be undertaken. Now, I could talk quite a lot about domestic premises, and there's an appendix in a guidance document. Unfortunately, I don't have the time today. So what I'll do is I'll refer you to the HSE's website, where there is quite a substantial amount of information. And there's a nice big table in there, which does highlight, obviously, what a domestic property is and what a non-domestic property is. Excuse me. So if we now think we've got we know who the duty holder is, we know what the duty holder's got to do. We then need to think about the management plan. And of course, we also need to think about what is involved in managing asbestos, and what does managing asbestos actually mean? So what we often hear, and I'm sure there's many consultants listening to this who do a similar role to myself, is what we tend to hear from some clients is, all I need is a survey. If I have a survey, surely I'm managing asbestos. Not quite. Just tell the contractors where the asbestos is. Okay, that's great, because there is a communication there, but how is that going to be communicated? Is it going to be by way of toolbox talks? Is it going to be by way of site visits? Is it going to be a way by training people to tell them where the asbestos is? I hear this one a lot, and I might upset people, especially in the health and safety sector, with regard to policies, and I'll come to policies shortly, but I have an asbestos policy, therefore I must be managing asbestos. And we also hear, I have a management plan. But is it a management plan in the context of what an asbestos management plan should actually look like? Or does it overlap with the policy? So this is what we hear, but what we are saying here is that's not enough. It's not enough just to provide a survey. This is not a duty to survey. This is a duty to manage asbestos. And there are cases where we could, in theory, have a management plan without an asbestos survey, just by doing a visual and making a presumption in our own premises. But that's we can save that for another day. So what I tend to find on my travels, and what I tend to find when delivering training courses to this level, is most organisations will generally have 3 key documents within their organisation to assist them with managing asbestos. The first one is, let's assume they've had an asbestos survey. That survey report will tell them what they've got, where it is, how much there is, and the condition of it. So the survey report is saying, this is what we've got. Then, of course, the management plan is more of a doing action. So it says, what are we doing? Who is going to do it? When are they going to do it? And more importantly, when did they did it? So there is a traceable record that can go back to suggest that they have actually been managing asbestos. And again, then we move to, we'll come to the policy in a second, the other additional documents that do need to be part of the management plan. So the management plan will require an asbestos register. The register will be a document which stays with the life of the building. It will be kept up to date as and when works are undertaken on the asbestos containing materials. The action plan is, this is what we are doing, who is going to do it, when is it done by, has it been done? And then the communication plan is how we're going to share this information, how we're going to tell people where the asbestos is. Is it by way of labelling? Is it by way of toolbox talks? And then we can come to the policy. Now, again, I'm not a health and safety practitioner, and I know there are many health and safety practitioners, so I'll apologise if I say something out of turn here, but for me, an asbestos policy is not a requirement to comply with this duty to manage. There's no requirement to have an asbestos policy. I do tend to find asbestos policies will tell us what asbestos is, why it's a problem, what the law says, and what we're going to do. Well, we know what the law says, everybody. We know what we've got to do. It's written down in law. All we really need to do is follow what that law says and follow the guidance provided by the HSE. So the key document is the middle document. But how is that middle document actually made? Well, it's actually made from the asbestos survey report. So If we look at the survey report, and let's say, for example, we had a survey done, I don't know, let's say 2 weeks ago, and the surveyor identified some asbestos which needs to be removed or needs to be repaired. As soon as that removal is undertaken, that survey report is in theory out of date because it's not showing a true reflection of what asbestos is within that premises. So what we need to do is we need to use the survey report, and we need to extract our data out of that survey report, and we drop all that data into our asbestos register. Therefore, if something is removed, if there is asbestos which has been sealed and it has been inspected, the register can then be updated. The register has an intrinsic link with the action plan, because the action plan will mirror what the register says with regard to what there is in that building, and the action plan should then go forward to say, this is obviously what we need to do with it periodically, okay, whether it's every 12 months, 6 months, or maybe even longer. So this is where you can utilize the data we've been provided, as opposed to just providing a copy of a survey to a contractor and say, have a look at that, that's where the asbestos is. It's falling far short of what a management plan should actually be. Now, with regard to the management plan, a written management plan, electronic or paper, needs to be prepared. And of course, the details of that management plan should include identifying the person responsible for managing that risk. So that would be the duty holder. So who is the duty holder? If there is an appointed person, who is the appointed person? Is there a deputy in their absence? The management plan should obviously detail copies of the registers, where it's kept. How is it accessible? Is it via intranet? Is it via an internet site? Is it hard copy on site where people can view it on site before obviously they do works? The instructions that any work on the fabric of the building cannot start without the relevant parts being checked, and making sure it's checked within good time. The reason that we need to check it in good time is that there are certain asbestos containing materials that do require a 14-day notice before they're allowed to be removed under the current legislation. And of course, if we check it just before we start work, we might find that we can't actually do that work because it possibly should have been notified to the HSE 2 weeks in advance. We need to make sure that checks will be made, that the information on the presence of asbestos has been understood. And I'm going to come back to that one a little bit later, because I think that is very, very important. And of course, if we do appoint contractors to carry out any works on the asbestos, whether that be encapsulation or removal, we need to make sure they're competent. We also need to make sure that the correct controls have been checked that they will be using to carry out that work safely. And then, of course, the last one there is the plans for the necessary work identified from the risk assessment, whether that be to repair, protect, or actually remove the ACMs. Apologise for the top one, that's just a repeat from the last one. I noticed that yesterday. The schedule for monitoring the condition of the ACMs. How often is it going to be monitored? So are we going to go down a 12-monthly period? Are we going to do 6 months? Or can we extend it beyond the 12 months? And again, I'll explain that shortly and where that is stated. How are we going to communicate that plan? So although we said earlier, just tell the contractors where it is, how are we going to do that? Are we going to do that by way of toolbox talks, by way of on-site assessments? Is it by way of training and giving access to the information that they need? And then, of course, contingency arrangements in place for the main contact. Sorry, if the main contact is not available. So maybe a deputy appointed person or a deputy duty holder. So at this point, we now know what should be in our management plan. We then need to action that management plan. And the action plan needs to be, or should prioritise the actions identified from the assessments that are undertaken. And it certainly should give a high priority to damaged materials and materials that are likely to be disturbed. So, of course, in essence, by putting the plan together, the duty holder or the appointed person has actually done a risk assessment on the asbestos containing materials, and it might be that works need to be undertaken as soon as possible. Now, if duty holders are unaware of how to implement a management plan themselves, they know their building, I'm sure they won't have a major problem with this. They could seek competent special advice from maybe an asbestos surveyor, maybe the surveyor who actually done the survey. They would be able to assist and give some sort of guidance. UCAS Laboratories, they've got a wealth of experience and lots and lots of qualifications and competency in place to assist duty holders. You could appoint a licensed contractor to assist you. I wouldn't advise it personally, and I apologise if any licensed contractors are listening to this, because licensed contractors make a living out of removing asbestos. They tend to have one recommendation, and that recommendation does tend to be remove, or remove, because if it's removed, there's nothing to manage, but of course they get work out of it. Asbestos removal is very expensive, and if we can try to manage it, we could possibly defer the removal to a later date, or any other competent person as appropriate. Now, the plan should include procedures and responsibilities to ensure the information is shared. The register and drawings, this is important, that they're kept for the life of the site and kept up to date. This is 16 years old. We should be able to go back 16 years and see how many re-inspections have been undertaken on the asbestos containing materials. I think the best I've got so far is about 8 years, because obviously it's taken a long time for people to understand about keeping these records for the life of the building. And then again, just to reiterate this point, work should only start once the duty holder is satisfied the information is known and understood. At that point also is satisfied that the information they've received is accurate. If there is any doubt, then they may require additional inspections, further inspections, to identify any possible areas which may have been missed on the original survey. Don't just assume that people have understood an asbestos management plan or a register or even a survey report. We do have a lot of European labour in the UK. Their English skills are very good. Their spoken word is very good. Their reading skills might not be as some of us. So we do need to sometimes communicate this in a way that they do actually understand it. One quick way around that is give them the register or the report and then take it away from them and then ask them questions about it. Because invariably they won't take that register to where they're actually working. What they will do is they will leave that on site and then go to the work area, and they may have forgotten some of the other areas. So now it's the sort of final stage. So we've got our management plan, we've implemented and actioned the management plan. Then we need to think about reviewing and updating the management plan. So with regard to that, there's two sections to this. The first one is to review the management plan every 12 months. It may have to be reviewed more often than that if circumstances have changed, such as asbestos has been removed, the register might need to be updated, or the individuals involved in the management, such as the duty holder or the appointed person, if they're a named individual, they may well have moved on. So restructuring happens quite a lot in organisations. So it's worth keeping an eye on that management plan. Now, this part of the management plan is reviewing the management plan. It's not about identifying the suspected ACMs and re-inspecting them. There's another paragraph in L143, and it goes on to say any identified ACMs must be inspected in its condition periodically. It doesn't say 12 months anymore. It used to. It changed when they changed the regulations in 2012. Periodically could be every 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, 2 years, but it is always going to be determined on the risk associated with the product. For example, if we've got an asbestos toilet cistern which has contains amosites, very low risk product, is there any value in inspecting that every 12 months? If you choose to do that, that's fine. What I'm trying to demonstrate here is that this is not it doesn't have to be done every 12 months. It's periodically. For those who I done one of these IOSH webinars for IOSH a number of years ago, and I got a lot of questions over the statement I've just made. For reference, I'm just going to go back one slide. This paragraph is paragraph 143 out of the approved code of practice. This paragraph is, if you keep reading, is paragraph 144. So if you read on after where it says 12 months, you will obviously see that statement. Last thing to consider is communicating and sharing the plan. So duty holders need to make sure they share that information. If you've got lots and lots of buildings scattered around the UK, if you are the duty holder, you might not have the time to access and visit all these premises on a regular basis. So it might be wise to think about advising site managers and giving some responsibility to site managers to keep an eye on the asbestos and maybe become an appointed person or an assistant appointed person on these sites. However, the duty holders do need to tell employees what the management plan arrangements are. They should provide emergency services with information. please do not go to your local fire brigade and provide them copies of any surveys or asbestos management plans. They're not going to be interested. All they need to know is there any asbestos on that particular site? So when they do go out on a shout, they can access their database, and their database will normally flag up, yes, there is asbestos, and then they can deal with any potential contamination thereafter. And of course, more importantly, provides copies of the plan to the trade union representatives, which is also a requirement. So how can UCATA help, or how can UCATA members help? Well, UCATA about 4 years ago developed 2 courses because there was a shortage of this in the marketplace, and there were other management training courses out there, but they didn't target the appointed person. So the first one on the left is the appointed person course, which is a 3-day course, which this section you're seeing now, I'm going to deliver in 30 minutes. I would normally take about 5 hours to deliver that, and we would go into a lot more detail. The other course on the right is the 1-day overview. So this would be aimed at assistants of duty holders or assistants of appointed persons, or even landlords and managing agents who just want a little bit more information about what the legislative requirement is with regard to management. And it might be a step in the way to moving on to the appointed person if they see fit. So last section from me, very, very quickly, because again, this could take several hours to talk about asbestos surveys. Very quickly, the guidance on the right there is HSG 264. It came out in February 2010. It's intended to give guidance to surveyors, but also to clients as well. The previous document, which was MDHS 100, never really engaged with the client, whereas this document, there are sections in there that clients do need to be privy to, and it's worth having a look at that, of what you need to be provided with and what you need to provide the surveyor with. And it all comes down to this scope of the survey. If the scope is right, then of course you're going to get that good quality, good value for money survey. Now, if you are appointing an asbestos surveyor, some of the things you need to think about here, you need to think about the competency of that surveyor, not just the company. So a good example of that is you could have a, dry throat today. You could have an asbestos surveyor who surveyed domestic dwellings. That's all they've done. But you are responsible for a hotel or a hospital. Are they considered competent to survey those premises? And the answer simply is going to be no. Are they accredited? What I mean by that is, are they UCAS accredited to ISO 17020? Do they need to be accredited? Well, I'll answer the second question first. As the answer is no, they don't need to be accredited. There's no legal requirement. However, the HSE do strongly recommend that accredited surveyors are used. And I have heard, I don't know how true this is, that some health and safety inspectors from the HSE have said that if a non-accredited survey is issued, they won't recognise it. So that could then fall back to the client in the sense that, have they done their due diligence? Now, if they are accredited, what you will be able to answer is this, because they have to go through competency assessments and they have to be signed off to survey various different types of premises. What caveats, exclusions will there be? Caveats, exclusions, these are what you're not going to get for your money. So these are the areas where the surveyor is not going to go. So it might be underfloor service ducts, it might be above roof spaces, it might be in lift shafts. We tend to find these at the end when the survey survey report is provided. Ask to see them at the beginning, ask to see them as part of the survey planning stage. That way you can exclude some of them and insist that those areas are inspected. If we do that, we will also eliminate these no accessed areas. So again, I'd love to have an audience in front of me now and ask the question, how many of you, if you've got surveys or are looking at survey reports, see the word no access? It causes huge problems. The reason being is, once it's got no access, you have to then presume there is asbestos in that area. And if you do your risk assessment of that area, generally speaking, you're going to err on the side of caution, which is going to put it out of sync. And of course, you're going to prevent maintenance activities being undertaken in that area. But again, equally, if this is done correctly as part of this, this should be minimized to an absolute minimum. So one of the things I would advise is you need to see a copy of what's called a survey plan. The scope of the survey needs to be full and frank and have all the detail necessary. And the last one is a simple one. What type of survey do you want? Why do you want it? Do you want it just to comply, or do you want it because you're doing maintenance works or refurbishment works or even demolition works? So There are two different types of surveys in HSG 264. They are a management survey, and then there's the refurbishment and demolition survey. To be honest with you, there are three types of survey there. There is the management, there is a refurbishment, and then there is a demolition survey. The demolition survey, that's an access all. That has to be access all areas and even some structural areas, maybe with assistance from the demolition contractor. The refurbishment survey tends to be more targeted to where the works is being undertaken. So for example, if you are undertaking a refurbishment of a bathroom or a kitchen, then of course a refurbishment survey needs to be undertaken in there. Refurbishment and demolition surveys will be destructive. They will damage the fabric of the building, so clients need to consider this. And then the top one, the management surveys, that's the standard one. That's the survey a lot of organisations will use to ensure they can use that data to comply with regulation for the duty to manage. They will take samples, they'll make presumptions, they'll provide an assessment. The question there is it intrusive? I believe it is intrusive, and it should go above ceilings, and it should go into floor spaces, which are accessible, but it won't break through that plasterboard wall. It won't break through that plasterboard ceiling. It will go where the maintenance contractors go, or it should go where the maintenance contractors go. That way we can eliminate those no accessed areas. The last one, which isn't a survey, it's called a re-inspection. So a re-inspection would be done periodically, as we said earlier, whether it's done annually, whether it's done every 12, 18, 2 years, that is entirely up to the duty holder based on the risk associated with the products they've actually identified. So you've got three types of surveys there, and then of course you've also got the re-inspection. I'm just going to try and bring this to a close now, just quickly to show you, if you haven't seen what a survey, this is just a front cover of an asbestos re-inspection. Don't worry about it. It's just to show you what a re-inspection looks like. Within that re-inspection, there will be details of what they've actually found. So this is the original survey here, and you can see they've identified it's still there. This is the asbestos cement, surface sealed, low damage, and of course it's got a relatively low score with a recommendation of no attention required label if you choose to label. This one, for example, is looking at the floor tiles and the adhesive. Again, a well-bound material, completely sealed, good condition, very, very low score, inspect prior to disturbance. That will then follow on for the surveyor to put together a re-inspection register. So this is all the details of what is within the premises, very similar to a management survey or a refurbishment survey, risk assessment details here, and then sort of final recommendations. The recommendations are only that. They are only a recommendation, but clients are free to do as they see fit. So at that point, you should now be more familiar with who the duty holder should be, what they have to do, how they can do this, and some useful advice when appointing a surveyor. What's next? Well, the next thing is, if you've identified asbestos within the premises that does need to be removed or repaired, you need to think about who is going to do that. So is that going to be a licensed removal contractor, or is it a non-licensed work activity? If that is the case, then of course you have to make that decision, but unfortunately we'll have to save that for another day. So at that point, thank you very much for your time. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you've got something out of it. Are there any easy questions?
All right. Thank you so much, Graham. There is one question that has come up, which I've pinned. As duty holder, does the plant manager need to be, to have been on a certified course? That's from John Crossland. Okay, John. It does depend on what the plant manager is actually doing with regard to the asbestos. If the plant manager is involved in maybe reassessing the asbestos containing materials, then yes, it would be required to give them the competency to be able to do that. However, if the plant manager is literally just looking after the plant, but there is somebody else that would action any issues such as emergencies or possible damage caused by work or some other disturbance that's occurred, and they can refer it back, all they would require is an asbestos awareness course, so they know what to do in the event of some damage or some disturbance. Okay, so the next question from Sheila O'Sullivan. Why do SSIPS assessors ask for their member contractors to have received asbestos awareness refresher training annually?
Right, okay. Asbestos awareness training is not an annual refresher requirement. It used to be. The HSE amended the regulations back in 2012, and I can't parrot fashion what it says, but it says some form of refresher should be undertaken. Now, that refresher training could be undertaken by way of a toolbox talk or an internal training program, which would satisfy the legislative requirement. With regard to SSIPs, maybe their requirement is that they want to see certification of that. So that's where obviously UCATA will provide the asbestos awareness certification. Now, we get this a lot at UCATA, and Craig, I don't know if Craig answered the question yesterday, why do UCATA certificates have an expiry date on them, when I've just explained that it's not written in the legislation. UCATA believe, and that's their belief, is that they think it should be done every 12 months. The HSE say it should be done every 12 months, but it doesn't necessarily have to be in a formal course. But with regard to operatives remembering what the requirements of asbestos and the asbestos awareness training that provides them with, sometimes they do forget it. So that's UCATA's position on it. But from a legal point of view, they don't need to do it every year. But if SSIPs want evidence of that, then of course the external courses provide certification for that to satisfy SSIPs assessors.
Thank you, Graham. I'm going to, if you'll give me a minute, I'm just going to ask Marcus to comment on that as well.
Okay.
So they only allow for 2 presenters. I'm just going to add him in. Hi, Marcus. Hi, Marcus. Hi, Marcus. So we don't seem to be able to. Okay, I'm going to take you back to Graham. Hold on a moment, we'll get him back. And if you do have any questions for Marcus, what I will do is I will pop him I'll pop his email address in and mine as well, so that you can send him any questions. Hold on a moment, I'm going to pop Graham back in. Hi, Graham, are you back? Hi, Graham.
Hang on, turn my video on. That's it. I'm back.
You're back. There we go. So I think there's a slight delay when I have to switch over because it only allows for 2 presenters.
Okay.
Okay, so I have suggested that if anyone, would like to contact Marcus, that they email through to myself or to him. I'll provide his email address. The next question that we had, let me just go back down to that, was could you briefly define the difference between licensed and non-licensed ACM removal?
I'll try. There's quite a lot to it, but it's all based on risk. And what we generally determine the risk from is the type of product. So I'll make this as basic as possible. Any works on spray coatings, thermal insulation, or asbestos insulation board, or AIB, generally are perceived to be licensable work activities. There are a couple of exemptions for AIB, which is short duration, but that's going to take me too long to explain. All the other products that sit below that, such as textiles, such as asbestos cement, such as floor tiles, they would all be classed as a non-licensed work activity. So we ascertain the risk from the type of product. Many years ago, we had a product-based approach, and then we moved to a risk-based approach. And the risk, the level of the risk is determined by what we call a control limit. And this is a figure set by the HSE of 0.15 per centimetre cubed over a 4-hour period. So if that level of exposure is likely to exceed that figure, then of course it's going to be a licensable work activity. So generally, as a rule of thumb, people working on AIB, thermal insulation and spray coating will normally exceed that level, therefore it becomes licensable. Below that, obviously it becomes a non-licensed work activity.
Great, thank you. Another one we have is they would like your viewpoint. Do housing stock asbestos information need to be in the AMP when it's considered not part of PAR 212? Furthermore, what's your viewpoint on letting tenants know about ACMS in their property?
Okay, so with regard to the asbestos management plan, we've seen that there's a requirement to re-inspect asbestos containing materials periodically. If a housing association goes through to try to manage the asbestos, although there's no requirement to do it under Reg 4, if they try to adopt that, there's going to be a requirement to revisit these properties on a very regular basis to inspect the asbestos. So my advice is you need to sort of separate this. The common parts do need to be in the asbestos management plan because they are non-domestic. But of course, your domestic properties are still required to be inspected so you can carry out your maintenance works. And that would be held under Regulation 5, Identification of Asbestos. With regard to the viewpoint on letting tenants know about ACMs in their properties, it's a tough one, this one. Me sitting here who doesn't deal with tenants on a day-to-day basis, I could gladly say, yes, why not? Be honest, be transparent about it. The problem you face is that tenants don't understand what asbestos is and the risks associated with it. So we often hear this one fibre kills theory, and they go onto the website and they find that it only takes one fibre to kill, which is factually incorrect. And when you speak to Roger in a couple of weeks' time, I'm sure he may use that in his presentation. But they don't understand the true risks behind it. So legally, with regard to the Landlord and Tenant Act, you should go try to provide them with information and tell them not to disturb the walls and the floors and the ceilings to try to protect them. But again, it's one of those you might open up the doors to complaints and questions. What I know a lot of housing associations have actually done is they've actually put a very brief summary of the asbestos register in the gas meter housing cupboard or the electric meter, because the electricians or gas engineer who go there to do maintenance works, then that's accessible there and then. That's another way of communicating it. But I could sit here and say, yes, tell the tenants. And if I was a tenant, I would like to know, but then I do know the risks associated with asbestos. So it needs to be put across in a very, very sensitive manner, because some people could get very concerned by it, especially if they've had family members that have died from asbestos-related diseases.
Right, thank you very much, Graham. We don't seem to have any more questions that have come through. So I would like to thank everybody for attending today's event. I'm sure that you're also going to be eager to sign up for our final webinar on Friday, 4th of December, where Professor Roger Wiley will be presenting on the topic of asbestos in soils. The details will be made available on social media, such as LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter, or you can go onto our website for further information, www.smazltd.com. Thank you very much for all your questions and once again, Graham, thank you so much for your time. It was really extremely interesting.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.